you, Lexi. Um, Please note that today's webinar and the contents of the webinar was developed under a grant number H421F240198 from the Department of Education. However, the contents do not necessarily reflect the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. I forgot to mention that we will be relaunching the poll at the very end with the same questions. So please keep in mind that that will be requested at the very end. And now I'm excited to introduce you to Sarah Solis, founder and CEO of Labyrinth Consulting, LLC. She is a seasoned grant writing specialist with extensive experience in helping business secure funding. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us today.
Thank you, Ruth. This is Sarah. Welcome, everyone, and thank you to the National Disability Institute for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm really excited to be here with you today. Like Ruth said, my name is Sarah Solis. I have a background in the social sciences and business. And for the last few years, I worked for and led a biomedical startup here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We created artificial intelligence or AI-based screening tools for eye disease and comorbidities of diabetes, like diabetic retinopathy. We also did a lot of grant or proposal writing, especially focused on the Small Business Innovation Research or SBIR program. After leaving the biomedical startup, I decided to use my experience as a startup leader and grant writer to found my own company, Labyrinth Consulting, in order to help other businesses access non-dilutive or grant funding and develop their early commercialization strategy. And that's what we're going to talk about today, grant writing and specifically the SBIR program. I want to emphasize, though, that while I'm going to talk about small businesses and technology development and the SBIR grant program specifically, the principles that I'm covering will apply to many different kinds of grant applications. My goal for the next couple hours is to give you more of a workshop than a lecture, so that by the time we're done, you'll have an overview of some of the best practices and the SBIR program, and you'll also have started on your own grant applications. We're going to be covering a lot of information in a short amount of time. Don't feel like you have to memorize any of it. Just keep in mind that with some planning and some strategizing, you can apply for your own grants. And the work that you do to submit a grant application will help you in other areas of your organization. So if you'd like to share, please write a brief introduction of yourself or your company in the chat and include a few words about what you're working on or what you'd like to apply for or where you are in the grant writing process. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda. We're going to start with an overview of the grant or proposal writing process. And just to let you know, I'm going to use those two words, grant and proposal, interchangeably, as we're talking about the material you create to apply for a grant. Next, we'll focus on the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, or SBIR program, starting with an overview. We'll take a short break, and then we'll come back to talk about SBIR strategy and budgets. We'll have lots of breaks for questions, and at any point, you can put those into the chat as well. Next slide. So let's get started with the why and how of grant writing. Next slide. Why apply for a grant? Whether you're thinking about starting a small business or a nonprofit, you know that your resources, including time and money, are limited and precious. In the case of a small business or startup, another one of those resources is ownership of your company. And the longer you can keep that ownership intact, the better, because you and your investors will own larger shares of the company. Grants are one way that you can access seed funding to pay for early research and development without having to give up equity in or ownership of your company. Depending on what kind of business you're in or what kind of technology you're developing, you may have to exchange equity for funding later on. A biomedical startup, for example, may need many years and many millions of dollars to turn its research into a product to sell. And this is because the industry is highly regulated, so that companies need to invest in regulatory approvals that entail extensive testing, validation, clinical trials, complex applications, and so on. If you have a company that's going to need this kind of investment at a later stage of development, you can set yourself up to be in a stronger position for pitches to investors by winning grants in the early stages, both for the funding itself, but also to show venture capitalists or others that your business and technology have been vetted by peers and funding agencies. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some best practices. Here are some general grant writing best practices that apply to any kind of application and to which we'll return when we focus in on SBIRs. Number one, give yourself plenty of time. I can tell you from experience, there's nothing worse than trying to cram 6 months to a year's worth of work into the space of a few weeks. So if you can, start researching and planning your proposal well ahead of time. If you're applying for a small grant, then a month or two may be enough. But for something like a federal grant, you should be preparing 6 to 12 months ahead, depending on how much work you've done already. You're going to need that time to do preliminary technical and market research, make the connections you'll need to round out your team, and contact potential partners or preliminary customers. Like so many things in life, grants depend in part upon relationships. And the more time you invest in developing those relationships, the easier the process will be when it's time to start writing, and more so when you have to start asking others to buy in and demonstrate their support for your work. Second, as I just mentioned, you have plenty of research to do just to prepare for the grant application. And that means on the web, in the lab, and in person. You may already know what you're applying for, or you may need to research what grants are available to you and what their application cycle looks like. You almost certainly need to understand the organization you're applying to and what they've funded in the past. Looking at databases of past awards can also help you identify other potential funders. In addition to technical research that produces the preliminary results that you can use to argue for your scientific approach, you'll need to be doing market research to establish that you're fulfilling a customer need. Who is this customer and how will you find them? What problem do they have that you can solve? And is it significant enough to motivate them to buy your product? How much is this solution worth? These are the kinds of questions you need to be asking of actual people in addition to the internet before you start writing. And all of this is applicable to any kind of grant, whether you're talking about customers or clients or other kinds of stakeholders. Researching and understanding the context that surrounds your particular problem and solution will help you to find the right funder and to build a strong argument about why your work deserves their support. Third, follow whatever directions you've been given in your notice of funding opportunity, request for proposals, or solicitation, and those are all synonyms. This is why I can't give you one template or style guide or for a proposal. Every funder wants something different and has specific instructions about how to present your application. Some organizations or agencies will do an administrative review of your proposal before they allow it into the next phase of the review process. If they find that you haven't followed their directions about formatting or page limits, for example, they may throw your proposal out before it even gets reviewed for content. And you absolutely do not want to do all of that work of putting together a proposal for nothing. So following the directions in a funding opportunity not only ensures that you get to the next stage, it also ensures that your proposal is easily readable. And this is really important. Don't make your reader work any harder than they have to. You want to keep them focused on your argument at all times, and following formatting directions helps to keep them focused rather than distracting them with type that's too small to read or whatever the case may be. So while following the directions may not seem like the most important part of a proposal, it can be what keeps you in the game rather than being eliminated right off the bat. Fourth, and this may be the hardest, define your scope. You need to strike a balance between trying to do too much versus not doing enough based on what your funder is looking for the funds they're offering, and the time available. It's important to be responsive to the funding opportunity, but obviously you'll be limited by time and money. So developing that scope and being really specific about what you're going to do is a balancing act, meaning that you're continuing to move back and forth between your goals and what you can do with the funds and time allotted until you reach the right balance. I know that was kind of broad, but we'll come back to this point later on when we talk about SBIRs. Fifth, find a friend or colleague who's not directly involved in the proposed project and ask them to review your application. One more reason to start early so that you have plenty of time for reviews and revisions. This reviewer can point out weaknesses in your argument, gaps in your research, and other things that you might have missed because of your immersion in the work, while you still have time to correct these mistakes. Next slide, please. The grant writing timeline. Let's delve a little more deeply into some of the best practices we just talked about. And first is the timeline. I have here an example of a 12-month timeline. I know the type is kind of small, but what's important here is the concept rather than the details, because those are going to differ from project to project. As I said before, if you're working on a large, complex proposal, you may need to start planning a year or more ahead of time, as I've shown here. Or for a smaller project, you could break this up into some other increment like weeks or months. The point is that you should plan out your time well in advance so that you're not rushing at the end. In this example, focused on a larger grant, I show starting with that research process. Possible grants, that's at the top left of the slide. Possible grants, funders, previous awards, a year or more in advance. Next comes registering your company on any websites or application portals, which can take some time, and you don't want to get to the end of all this work and find that you can't even submit your proposal. So that's important. 10 to 11 months out, you're conducting preliminary research, both in the lab and in the market. At 9 months, you're continuing with market research and starting to analyze your data. At 8 months, you're thoroughly reading and researching your particular solicitation or request for proposals and creating a detailed plan for who's going to do what and when. 7 months out, you're reaching out to potential collaborators. And at 6 months, you're drafting objectives or specific aims and also starting any paperwork required by your collaborators. This is another point in the process that can take a significant amount of time, especially if you're dealing with a large bureaucracy like a university. So don't wait until the last minute. 5 months out, you can use your objectives to start drafting your research plan and any supporting illustrations. At 4 months, you can start on the budget. 3 months out, you draft letters of support and send them to potential collaborators or customers for signatures. Also, identify an outside reviewer. 2 months out, you should start working with your independent reviewer and, if possible, on teams within your company to review and revise your proposal. With 1 month to go, you should have collected all of the supporting documentation, like those collaborator letters, and be finalizing your proposal package for submittal to your funding agency. Plan to submit at least a couple of days, if not a week ahead of time before the due date, because if the funder's website crashes or you have other technical difficulties, you may miss the deadline. And again, all of that hard work will have been for nothing. Next slide, please. Grant writing research on grants.gov. With this slide, I wanted to show you an example of the grant research, in this case on grants.gov, which includes federal grants like SBIRs as well as others. As you can see on the left, you can search by keyword and then narrow by status. I've chosen forecasted and posted, and funding type, I've chosen grant. If you look at the results on the right, you can see they're organized by opportunity, number, title, agency, status, posted date, and close date or due date. You can see that the first couple come from the Department of the Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, and after that, we see some from Health and Human Services. Next, please. So scrolling down on the same web page, you can see on the left that you can filter by eligibility. I chose small businesses, category, and agency. On the right, you can see more results. And if you click on one of the opportunity numbers, you'll go to a page with more information about that particular grant, including the actual funding opportunity. Next, please. So now we have grant writing research on sbir.gov/topic. Similarly, you can use the site to search specifically for SBIRs. In this example, I use the keyword pain to start my search up on the left. And then as you scroll down, you can refine your search, starting with opening and closing dates, and you can see the results on the right. Next, please. You can also refine results by status. I chose open and agency. And then on the right, at this point on the right, you can see some results from the Department of Health and Human Services. Next, please. Scrolling down further, you can refine by phase 1 or 2, program, SBIR or STTR, we'll talk about that later, and funding year. So if you're looking for federal grants or SBIR specifically, grants.gov and sbir.gov are good places to search. If you're looking for nonprofit grants, there's a database called Candid that you can access through your public library or university library. And of course, there's basic internet research, signing up for newsletters to be notified of funding opportunities and so forth. And if you have other sources for grants that you have found or that you like, feel free to share those in the chat also. Next, please. So just briefly on grant writing, solicitations, and instructions. Again, we're going back to that list of best practices, and I want to show you a couple of examples related to the funding opportunities themselves and the directions for completing an application for this kind of grant. On the left is an SBIR notice of funding opportunity from the National Institutes of Health, which is 19 pages long. And I would say that's, maybe it's average, but I've seen some that are much longer. On the right are the instructions for creating that proposal, which include 179 pages of instructions. What I want to highlight here is that this kind of proposal is a significant commitment of resources. Receiving the grant is going to be a significant infusion of resources, but it's not the work of a few weeks. You need to prepare and make a plan. So with that, let's jump into our first grant writing activity. Next, please. Start your plan. Here's the first of our activities, which we'll build upon throughout the presentation. If you haven't already received it, you'll get a handout along with the slides that you can use to outline your proposal and which follows the activities we're doing today. Otherwise, if you have a piece of paper and something to write with or your computer, let's take a couple minutes to address these 5 items. Have you found a funding opportunity? What is it? Do you have a timeline for your application? Sketch it out. Have you thoroughly read the request for proposals? What stood out to you? Have you started to outline your scope? What questions has this raised? And who might be willing to review a draft? Start brainstorming a few names. And we'll just take a couple minutes so you can take some notes. All right. Next slide, please. How do you craft a compelling argument? Now that you're thinking about your own proposal writing effort, let's talk about constructing an argument. This slide shows a much used model for thinking about rhetoric or persuasive communication. The model was developed by Aristotle, who broke the art of persuasion into 3 categories: logos, or the part of communication having to do with research and facts; pathos, the part that elicits an emotional response; and ethos, which relies on a speaker's expertise and credibility. To construct a compelling argument, we need to include all 3 of these elements. But I decided to illustrate this model as a pie chart with the piece on the right separated from the rest, because I want to draw your attention to one of the components that's particularly important for proposal writing. To be completely honest, I didn't find this model that interesting or useful when I first learned about it, but when I thought about applying it to grant writing, it seemed a lot more relevant. And so let's look at the next slide. How do you craft a compelling proposal? So here we see the same diagram as on the previous slide, but I've replaced the original language with words you'll see as you're writing grant applications: innovation, significance, and team, all of which are important for the SBIR and, I would argue, any other grant writing process. In this diagram, innovation is like logos, the part of the proposal that describes your research. In an SBIR, this is the technical heart of your proposal, in which you explain your invention, your innovation, your solution. You answer the question, what's new here? What am I doing differently that no one has ever done before? Significance is like pathos, the part of your proposal in which you make your reader care. Here you're providing background on the importance of your problem and the potential impact of your solution. You're answering the question, who cares about this work and why? Finally, on the right side of the diagram, team corresponds to ethos and the expertise of you and your collaborators. Although innovation, significance, and team are all necessary components of your argument, I wanted to highlight the team because I think it's sometimes easy to gloss over. It's obvious that you need to describe your new idea and why it's important, but it's just as important to talk about who will execute your vision and why they're qualified to do so. Otherwise, there's no point in even talking about the vision. We'll come back to these concepts when we talk more about the SBIR proposal, but just remember that you need all 3, logos, pathos, and ethos, facts, emotion, and authority, or innovation, significance, and team, to build the argument that's going to persuade your reviewers. Next slide, please. All right, let's take a couple more minutes to start building the argument that you'll develop in your proposal. Answer these 3 questions for yourself. Describe your innovation, or what's new. Describe your significance, or who cares. And describe your team. What's your expertise? Okay, let's go on. Next slide, please. So that's the end of our section about grant writing in general. Does anyone does anyone have any questions so far?
I have a question. Can I have a question? Let me see.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Um, on the grants in grant.gov, you had post date and then you had closing date. On some of them, they were a period of 3 months. On others, I saw a period of 2 years. I was wondering, is there with the ones with 2 years, does that mean it's like a revolving review? It's not if it posted or opened in 2025, they don't review it into 2027. That's I'm trying to understand why that date was so drastic. And then I saw some for DHHS that were also posted start date January, but closing date April of the same year.
Right. So I think I think what you said is correct, that those longer ones, for the most part, are going to be a situation where the agency is accepting applications on a rolling basis or a revolving basis, like you said. Um, you need to check the solicitation to be sure. I mean, I can't say for certain because every one of them is going to be slightly different. But yeah, that some of them do operate that way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the second question was about the third, like the other one that was only 3 months. They don't give you that year or even 6 months to prepare. Is that because we know that it comes around every year and we still should plan for it? If we had not yet already started the process for next year, or how do you describe those that opens in January but close in April?
Right. So again, every agency works differently, but and let me just add a caveat, which we all know, things are in flux right now. So, this could be changing as I speak. But in the past, some agencies, like the National Institutes of Health, have a regular schedule throughout the year, and they will accept proposals in January 5th, April 5th, September 5th, year after year. So in that case, yeah, well ahead of time, well ahead of 3 months, that it's coming up, and so you can start preparing. Others release topics once or twice a year. And so in those cases, when they release the topics, you have to go and check them and see what comes up and see how that fits into your work. So yes, you are going to have less time. But on the other hand, if you know that's how the agency operates, if you have a project that you think might be a good fit for the Department of Energy, for example, and they release their topics twice a year, then you can still be getting ready, maybe pursuing other opportunities in the meantime. But you're right. I mean, to some extent, that is going to shorten the timeline. But ideally, you would have done some of the work ahead of time, so you're not totally squishing it into those 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is.
Thank you.
Earlier in the registration, someone asked a question about AI, which I think also is kind of a, depends on the grant, depends on the agency answer. I think AI, using artificial intelligence, generative AI, to help write an application, I think it's a tool like anything else. It's one of many tools. It may be a good place to get started. I don't know that there's anything out there right now that can write you an entire proposal. And I would, as we all know, these programs make mistakes. You don't always know what it's telling you, where that came from. So I think you have to be cautious. And especially if you're working on, technology, I wouldn't go feeding any of your intellectual property into one of those models because, as we know, they work by mining all kinds of data. So I wouldn't put anything sensitive in there because you don't know where it's going to go. And let's see, in terms of agencies, some want to know if you've used AI, how much you've used it. Some, if they think you've used it to write your proposal, will just, trash your application. So again, I think it depends. I think it's a useful tool, but I don't think it's going to do all the work for you. Any other questions at the moment? If not, we can go to the next slide and we will start talking about the SBIR program. So now that we've talked about general grant writing best practices, we're going to start focusing in on the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, or some people say SBIR program. We could, and people do, spend days drilling down into the details and logistics of this program, but I'm going to present a pretty broad overview before going into more detail on SBIR proposal writing strategies that I think will be useful no matter which agency you're targeting. So the SBIR program is a public-private partnership in which the federal government provides competitive grants or contracts to small businesses to support innovative research and development, as well as eventual commercialization of that R&D. Next, please. Eligibility. To be eligible for an SBIR grant or contract, you must have a for-profit business in the United States that is majority owned by a U.S. citizen or permanent resident and has fewer than 500 employees. Next. Agencies. 11 federal agencies administer SBIRs, and the 3 largest include the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Energy. As you can see on the slide, some agencies award contracts and some award grants. And this is just one example of the fact that each agency works differently from the others, and each has its own SBIR process, from the release of funding opportunities to the review process. Each defines needs and innovation differently because each has its own mission. So even within the SBIR program, there's no one proposal template because each agency has its own requirements. This is also one reason it's important to start early, because the agency most relevant to your work might only release topics or accept proposals once a year. So you need to prepare differently depending on which agency you're targeting. I've listed this website at the end in the resources section, but one way to better understand the agencies and which ones align with your work is to visit sbir.gov/awards to see what kinds of projects each agency supports. You also need to be aware that some agencies have their own submission portals. So once you have a better idea of where you'll be applying, you need to check and see which company registrations you need to complete. So for example, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but everyone needs to be registered on sam.gov. But depending on if you're applying to the NIH versus the DoD, there might be other portals where you have to register your company, and you want to make sure you have plenty of time to do that. Next, please. SBIRs versus FTTRs. People often sort of talk about these with the same breath, and they are similar. The main difference is that the FTTR requires a partnership with a nonprofit research institution, whereas an SBIR allows subawards to institutions. So if you need significant support from a research institution, like maybe they have some kind of expertise or special equipment that you need, you may want to pursue the STTR. But either way, it's always the small business that receives and manages the grant, never the research institution. Next, please. Phases. So the SBIR process as a whole has 4 main phases. Phase 0 refers to the writing of your proposal and is not specifically funded by the SBIR program. Phase 1 is for proof of concept or feasibility. And your goal here is to demonstrate that you have a workable idea, both technically and to some extent commercially. In phase 2, you develop your idea into a prototype or minimum viable product. You work not only on technical development, but also commercial development, testing your value propositions, building your business model, and identifying your first customers and how you'll reach them. Phase 3 is what you're working toward throughout phases 1 and 2, and that's commercialization. The SBIR program doesn't fund phase 3 directly, but it can set you up for contracting opportunities at this point. So again, the SBIR program funds phases 1 and 2 in this list. Some agencies break phase 2 into more phases depending on the agency and the needs of the project. But in general, the program itself is going to fund phases 1 and 2. Next, please. So first steps. I know this is a lot of information all at once, but here are 3 first steps that you can take toward SBIR funding. First, like we just said, register with sam.gov and sba.gov. This process can take a few weeks, so you should get started right away. For this, you'll need basic information about your company. I've also added this to the resources slide, but if you have trouble with this step, you can contact your local Apex accelerator, that's APEX, for free assistance. And every state has one, so you just have to look up the one for your wherever you are. And they offer all kinds of assistance, all of it free. If you're interested in contracting, federal contracting, they're also a great resource for that. The second step you can take, you can look for funding opportunities on grants.gov and sbir.gov/topics. This may also take some time as you look at current and upcoming opportunities, as well as grants already awarded that will help you identify which agencies to target. And third, consider your timeline. I've included this graphic on the right, not because you need to remember anything that's on it, but because it shows how much the agencies vary in their timing. As I mentioned, some release topics and accept applications only once a year, some twice, and some more often. Once you know where you want to apply, you can start using their deadlines to plan your submission.
Can we just pause a moment? We're having a technical issue. We should be returning with the slides shortly. And the slides should now be available, so you can continue, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Thank you. So we can go to the next slide and our next activity, which is the SBIR checklist. So let's take a moment to go through this and answer these questions. Are you eligible? Have you identified an agency? Are you applying for an SBIR or STTR? Are you registered with sam.gov and sba.gov? And does your agency require additional registration? Okay, if we want to go to the next slide, we have another break for questions. If anyone has questions about the SBIR program generally.
Question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, you said, are we eligible on the checklist? When you say, are we eligible, Do you mean, are we nonprofit or are we for profit? Or did you mean something else by are we eligible?
That's correct. So you have to be for-profit, majority owned by a US citizen or permanent resident, and have fewer than 500 employees.
Thank you. And I just wanted to clear one thing. You said that Apex, APEX, would help us with registering for SAM.gov.
That's correct. Yes.
Thank
It's called the Apex Accelerator, and it's a federal program, I think, funded by the Department of Defense. And there's like a branch in every state. So you can, depending on where you are, you can look up your state's Apex Accelerator, and the people there will work with you if you have a small business for free to complete some of these registrations, which can be a little bit frustrating sometimes. It's not super hard, but it is you're sort of touching on the huge bureaucracy, and so they can help you navigate that process, and they're very knowledgeable.
We have some specific questions around very specific businesses, but sort of a general one that I think can apply to a lot of people is a concern around intellectual property and anything they should do to protect that when they're thinking about applying. And just, I don't know if you can talk or whether you'll get into it later in the slides, but we have had some questions around that.
I don't have a slide specifically on intellectual property. I mean, yes, you should look into protecting your intellectual property. And, there's plenty of advice out there. Ultimately, I think you need to talk to a lawyer who specializes in IP protection. As far as the grants, there are, and again, this is explained in more detail in the instructions for the SBIR proposal. They will tell you which sections of the proposal are going to be posted publicly, like, made public, so that you can decide, which kinds of information you want to put in which parts of your grant.
Thank you, Sarah. And then another general question. There can be obviously other reasons, but are there any benefits in terms of what we're talking about today, in terms of incorporating in any particular state?
That question is outside of my area of expertise in terms of, incorporating your business. In terms of the grant, it doesn't matter which state you're in. In terms of your business, I think you would have to ask a lawyer.
No, that's fine. I think I agree 100%. It was just trying to think if the grant had any implications about where you chose to set yourself up. And then if somebody also wants to work sort of internationally, you've already said that they have to be here, US citizen or a permanent resident. Do these grants allow somebody to, say, partner with a company in a different country, or are there any restrictions on working outside of the US?
In my experience, you can partner with people outside the US, but I am sure that it depends on the agency and the grant. In my experience of working with grants from the National Institutes of Health, I have had colleagues who have had that, they have been here and the company was here, but their project did relate to work going on in other countries, and the sort of clinical research and testing they did take place in other countries. So I think all of my answers are basically going to start with depends, because every agency is different. But is it possible at least sometimes? I would say yes.
Perfect. And then we have had some questions which NDI will explore further, but I'll just read it out so that we know that we haven't missed it. Kavita is, really curious to know if there are any grant opportunities specifically available for deaf-owned businesses, or any deaf professionals who specialize in reviewing grant applications before submission for deaf entrepreneurs. It's definitely something that NDI can continue to explore as we move through this field. I'm not expecting Sarah, you necessarily to have any information on that.
Yeah, that is a great question. So yeah, I have not come across, to answer the second part, I have not come across anyone. But yeah, I would be interested to know. As for the first part, I don't know that I've seen anything specifically. I would think that's definitely a possibility. I have not researched that particular question, so I can't answer for sure. But there are many different kinds of grants available and focused on all different kinds of communities. So if I had to guess, I would say yes, but I haven't looked into it specifically, so I'm sorry.
And it's certainly something we will be exploring as we move forward. And then one last quick question before we move on is someone just asked, what is Apex Accelerator?
So the Apex Accelerator is a federal program funded by the Department of Defense, and it's nationwide. There's an office in every state. And so whichever state you're in, you can look up your local Apex Accelerator and they will work with you for free. All their resources are free. I would say they're more focused on how to become or how to enter the world of federal contracting, which is, not totally unrelated to what we're talking to, given that some of the agencies work contracts rather than grants. But the point in common is that they can help you navigate SAM.gov and some of those other government registrations. For example, if you wanted to become a woman-owned small business or something like that, they can help you with that. They just have a lot of expertise in guiding you through the big federal, business registration portals, which can be complicated. So just kind of that first step of getting started, they can help you with that.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for people putting links in the chat. We will collect all of these and send them out in a follow-up email. Carry on putting in your questions. We will have time for more, but I'm going to turn it back over to you now, Sarah, to take us to the next part.
Yes, so I think if you go to the next slide, we've come to our break. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back to talk about SBIR strategy specifically. So I'll see you in a few minutes. All right. If we're ready, we can keep going. Next slide, please. All right, now we're going to start talking about the SBIR program and focusing on strategies for proposal writing. Next, please. Oh, actually, sorry. Well, that's fine. So we've completed our broad overview, and now we're going to talk more about strategy, much of which will be relevant to other kind of grants you might want to apply for. I'm going to be talking about technology, as I have been, but if you're working on a program or a system or some other kind of innovation, just substitute that for the word technology. Either way, the process of developing your proposal strategy will include many of the same elements. I also want to note that I'm going to approach strategy from two complementary perspectives. The first is scope, and the second is evaluation. You could think about them as two sides of the same coin, or you could think about the evaluation categories as a means of building out your scope. Use whichever framework is most helpful to you. So now we're going to talk about scope. Defining your scope means figuring out what you will do and how you will do it. In other words, defining success for your project and describing how you'll get there. Earlier, I mentioned striking a balance between objectives, funding, and time. And here I've broken that balancing process into 5 steps. Defining your problem, focusing on feasibility, choosing objectives, identifying and recruiting your team, and determining cost. When I said that you're going to have to go back and forth between the different elements until you strike the right balance, this is what I was talking about. Your goal for a phase 1 SBIR is to demonstrate feasibility. In other words, to show that your new technology will work in a research environment, which is the first step in proving that it will someday work for a customer in the real world. But what problem will your technology solve? You need to think about the relationship between the two. How are you going to define and frame your problem such that your technology presents a workable solution? You then need to choose a few objectives that will allow you to reach your goal of demonstrating feasibility. You need to figure out who's going to do this work and how much it's going to cost. If you define your problem too broadly, such that it requires 5 or 6 objectives to demonstrate feasibility, you may need extra team members, and the cost will exceed the budget ceiling. If you define your problem too narrowly, you may not be taking full advantage of the resources your grant offers. So each time you put a puzzle piece into place, you need to check the fit of the pieces around it. You have to go back, refine your problem, refine your objectives, your budget, and so on, until you can align the objectives and the cost to be achievable within the amount of funding and time that you have. The specifics are going to vary by agency. You may have $300,000 in a year, or you may have less, depending on where you're applying. Because you're limited by budget and time, you need to watch out for scope creep or promising too much. I know it can be tempting to want to do everything, or maybe to solve a bigger problem, but in the end, you'll look better if you can achieve your objectives rather than promising more than you can deliver. Next slide, please. The program officer meeting. So another thing you can do, in addition to thoroughly planning out the scope of your project, is to meet with a program officer to better understand their needs and to ask specific questions about the program in relation to your technology. You can find contact information for program officers within the funding opportunities, usually at the end, and you can reach out to set up an appointment. Be aware that for the SBIR program, even if your proposal isn't funded, you can submit one revision. So after you receive your reviews, you can request a debrief with your program official, and they can go through the reviewer scores and comments with you to help you understand why you weren't funded and how to improve your resubmission. Next slide, please. So the quad chart is part of your meeting with the program officer, which you need to be prepared for because they're probably not going to have a lot of time. A quad chart like this can help you describe your work, your company, and your commercial potential in a concise way so that you have time to ask the questions you've developed about how your work fits in to the agency's mission and needs. Next slide, please. So our next grant writing activity is focused on scope. And let's think about how to answer these questions. What problem are you solving? What is your solution? What are your specific objectives? Who on your team will address each objective? And what is the cost of team members' time? The more you can refine your answers, the more focused and specific you can be, the stronger your proposal. All right, next slide, please. Evaluation. So we've talked a little bit about developing scope, which you could think of as building from the bottom up. Now let's turn around and look at your proposal from the other direction, which is how it will be evaluated by reviewers. So maybe more of a top-down approach. This slide shows one example of an SBIR evaluation rubric. Although the words are different from those on the previous slide where we talked about scope, the ideas here are complementary. Significance, innovation, approach, investigator or team, and environment. We'll return to the budget at the end of the presentation, but in the meantime, let's go through these evaluation topics. Next slide, please. Significance. One way to think about the significance of your project is to ask yourself the who cares question. As you're writing your proposal, are you showing reviewers that someone besides you does or should care about your work? How many people care? How much is your solution worth to them? What's the potential impact? For an SBIR proposal, there are two components to significance: technical and commercial. In a phase one, you'll focus more on technical, that is, the significance of your technical solution to a problem. But that doesn't mean the commercial doesn't matter. Even though you're focusing on research and development, you still need to start figuring out the market for your product, which includes at least 4 elements. First, your value proposition. What value do you provide your customer? What need do you fulfill? What about your product convinces someone to buy or use it, especially if they're already addressing their need in a different way? So to explain the concept of value proposition, people make analogies that go something like this. Let's say your ideal customer is shopping for a new kitchen knife because they want to start eating salads for lunch. So what's the most important part of that sentence? And if you want, you can put your answer into the chat. Your ideal customer is shopping for a new kitchen knife because they want to start eating salads for lunch. So if you said that the most important part of that was my customer wants to eat salad, you're absolutely right. The knife isn't the most important thing. in that sentence. It's the customer's desire to eat salad. They don't need a knife per se. They need chopped up vegetables, and they may have a variety of options for fulfilling that need. How will your solution better address their need and help them reach their goal? It's important to keep this idea in mind as you're developing your technology. You don't want to get to the end of that process and find that you've invested all of your resources into something that your customer doesn't want or can't use because it doesn't solve a real problem. The best way to thoroughly understand what your customer does need is to go out and talk to them. And I know that can be daunting, but I guarantee you will learn so much more about how to get your technology from the lab to the market if you get out of your office and talk to people. So second, your business model. This is the second important component of commercialization. How will your company generate revenue from your product? Are you selling to other businesses or directly to consumers? Will you sell a product or a subscription? These are the kinds of questions your business model will answer. The third component, and they're all interrelated, is customer discovery, which we mentioned a minute ago. Who will buy your product and how much will they pay for it? How many customers do you have? And who do you need to talk to get this information? And finally, path to market. How will you reach your customers? How will your product reach them? Are you selling directly or through a distributor or another intermediary? Beginning to answer these questions in a phase 1 proposal shows reviewers that you understand the interdependence of technical and commercial significance, and that you need both to succeed. Also know that there are tools to help you start answering these questions and organizing your data. One is the business model canvas, which you can just search on the web to find examples. And if you want more guidance in using it, the Startup Owner's Manual or Business Model Generation can provide more guidance, as well as numerous business development programs that focus on the canvas. Next slide, please. Significance. So let's think about the significance of your work as you answer these questions. What's your technical significance? What's your commercial significance? And what do you know so far about your value proposition, your business model, your customer, and your path to market? Okay, next slide, please. Innovation. I'm guessing the innovation section will be the easiest for a technical founder to write because you already know the intricacies of your field and understand what's new and exciting about your technology. But don't get too comfortable. You usually don't know who your reviewers will be or how much they will know about your topic. So you need to find a balance between teaching and selling your idea. If you dive too deeply into the technical minutia of your work or use too much jargon, you may alienate your reviewers. This point is really important for any kind of grant writing. Again, you never want to do anything that's going to take the reviewer out of the story you're telling. Your goal is to immerse them in your argument, and every single element of your proposal should work together to contribute to this argument. Every piece of punctuation, every word, every figure, every concept, don't waste any of it. And so this section is a good place to think about your language and how you're communicating your ideas. You may also want to communicate visually. Graphs, flowcharts, and models can also help you make your point. Just make sure the text and the figures are complementary. They should share the same information in different ways. And don't rely on color to make your point, since a lot of reviewers will print out their proposals in black and white to read. And so they may not have that extra information that color provides. So even if you use color in your PDF or whatever you submit, make sure that it also works in black and white. Next slide, please. Let's take a moment to think about how you would explain your innovation to a non-specialist. Could you explain it to somebody in high school or college? How about a specialist in a different field or industry? Think also about figures you might create that would increase the impact of your argument. Where in the proposal would they go, and what would they illustrate? Okay, next slide, please. Approach. When we talked about scope, we talked about developing specific objectives and the need to balance your objectives with available time and funding. Here we're using the word approach, but we're still talking about planning out the discrete objectives that will allow you to complete your proposed project. These objectives are also called specific aims, and you want to choose 3 to 4 to focus your proposal on. Remember that you want to be ambitious but realistic. Don't overpromise. And as much as you can, make your objectives or specific aims somewhat independent so that even if you don't complete one, you can still complete the others. Or think about a backup plan. If one of your objectives doesn't work out the way you think it will, what are you going to do instead to keep the work progressing? As you begin to plan out exactly what you're going to accomplish, think about how to make your objectives, quote unquote, SMART. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. You can use these parameters to help you create a Gantt chart or some other kind of figure in which you build out the subtasks that support your objectives, the metrics by which you evaluate your progress, and the schedule for your completion of the project. Make this one of your figures. I want to emphasize here that you need to be as specific and realistic as possible. This is not to say that your plans won't change, because they almost certainly will. But remember that you're crafting an argument about your technical expertise and commercial value. Create a plan that convinces your reviewers you know what needs to be done and you know exactly how to do it. Next slide, please. So here I've created an example to illustrate the development of SMART objectives or aims. So I wrote out an example specific aim. The first step toward creating a diabetic retinopathy screening software is development of an algorithm to distinguish between stage 1 and stage 2 disease with 80% sensitivity and specificity. We have a retrospective database of 10,000 subjects with which to train the algorithm. We will spend 4 months training and 2 months validating our results. So is this specific? Yes. We're going to develop an algorithm to distinguish stages of disease. Is it measurable? Yes. We'll know we're done when we achieve 80% sensitivity and 80% specificity. Is it achievable? Yes. We have enough data and time to train and test that algorithm. Is it relevant? Yes. These are the steps toward our larger goal of creating diabetic retinopathy screening software. And is it time-bound? Yes. We've specified the amount of time we'll need to accomplish the work. So this is a simplified example, but it's the kind of objective or aim you would see on the first page of your research plan, sometimes called the specific aims page, whereas you'll go into much more detail later in the proposal. Also notice how much the steps in this objective rely on what we've touched on and we'll turn to again in a moment. Your expertise, and more importantly, your ability to convey that expertise to your reviewer. The better you construct your objectives, the better your argument will stand up against the reviewer's scrutiny. And remember, these are one of the first things that your reviewer is going to see. It may be a cliche, but first impressions matter. So make a good one. Next, please. So again, the slide shows kind of a simplified example of how you can put those SMART objectives or aims into a chart that gives more detail on the specific tasks that you'll need to complete to achieve your objective, in what order, and how long they're going to take to complete. So your specific aim 1, develop an algorithm. Task 1, organize the data set. Maybe that's what you're going to do in the first month of your project. Task 2, label the data set. That's what you're going to do in the second month. Also in the second month, you're going to separate your training and validation data set. In the third and fourth month, you're going to train your algorithm. And then overlapping with that in the fourth and fifth month, you're going to start analyzing your results. Finally, in the sixth month, you're going to validate your results. So again, this is simple, but you get the idea. You take your specific aim, which you've really carefully constructed to be as specific as possible. You break it down into tasks and then create a schedule for how and when you're going to complete those tasks. Next slide, please. Investigator and team. As we touched on when we talked about crafting your argument, and just now with the approach, your expertise and that of your team makes up a crucial part of your proposal. During my own startup experience, I heard numerous investors say that the strength of a team is one of the most influential factors on their decision to invest, and proposal writing is no different. If I were you, I would talk about your team's expertise in both the proposal itself, as well as the supporting documentation, which might include individual bios, as well as letters of support from various stakeholders. You need to be truthful in all aspects of grant writing, of course, but this is not the place to be shy. Emphasize your own and your team's experience and accomplishments, and how these will contribute to your future success. As with the objectives, be specific about what you and your team have achieved, but also help your reviewers to envision what you'll be able to accomplish together on this new project, because that's what this process is really about. Introducing your reviewers to your vision of a better future while you're showing them step by step how you're going to get there. Don't worry about whether or not you have all the expertise you need in your company or on your staff. You can always bring in extra support in the form of contractors and consultants. Showing that you have and understand the game plan is what's important. Next slide, please. Your team. Let's take a minute to think about your team and to identify what kinds of expertise you might be missing: technical expertise, business expertise, and also what roles you might still need. Team members, leadership, consultants, partners, subawardees. Okay, next slide, please. Environment. The environment for your project includes your technical and your commercial capabilities. Here's where you need to describe how your access to resources will contribute to your success. And that could be anything from computing resources to lab space to intellectual property lawyers or regulatory experts. If you're working with a research institution like a university or national lab, you can talk about how this partnership and access to their resources will further your work. Again, think about how your research environment reflects on your and your team's expertise, as well as how it will enable you directly to complete your objectives. Next, please. Let's take a minute to think about what other resources you might need to accomplish your objectives. Technical, experimental, computing, laboratory, commercial, legal, regulatory, or anything else you might think of. Okay, just to review for a moment, we talked about scope. We've been talking about evaluation. And these categories of evaluation: significance, innovation, approach, investigator or team, and environment. These are the kinds of categories that you will actually be scored on. The reviewers will read your proposal and they will give you numbers depending on how well they think you've addressed these categories. So I just want to reiterate how important it is to think about these as you're writing, to follow the instructions on the one hand, but also to think about how what you submit will be evaluated on the other hand, and to try to bring those things together to create the most complete proposal that you can. So next slide, please. So parallel development. We've been talking about how the phase 1 SBIR focuses on feasibility, or demonstrating that your innovation works on a basic level. which mostly means focusing on technical research and development. But I would also encourage you to keep in mind the big picture, and that means progressing on parallel tracks toward commercialization, which is the ultimate goal of the SBIR program. So in addition to the technical work, you need to keep working on market research and strategy, IP protection, regulatory strategy, if that's applicable to you. And then as you continue to progress things like usability, partnerships, pilot studies, and so on. What you see on this slide is just one example, and the details will be different for every project. But my point is that it's not enough just to focus on your innovation. That's where you start. And as you complete your R&D, the scale needs to shift from a technical to a commercial focus. Next slide, please. Here's another way of looking at what I just said about technical and commercial work proceeding in parallel. Again, it's super simplified, but you can see how your commercial tasks like market research, intellectual property protection, regulatory strategy, and product development all progress together along with your technical development. So in this example, I showed, again, it's very simple, but as you're starting your technical objective, which is to develop your algorithm, you're also starting to research your market to figure out how big it is, how much it's worth, who your competitors are. You might be talking to an attorney about patenting your technology. You go on to talk to consultants about the regulatory strategy, if that applies to you. Eventually, you may need to talk to a developer if you're developing software. So anyway, any number of things that you need to do alongside your basic technical R&D to get ready for the market, to get ready for commercialization. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment here to think about, in addition to technical, what requirements do you know of or plans do you have to address product, IP, regulatory, and/or commercial development? And what else does your industry require that maybe I haven't touched on here? Okay, next slide, please. Letters of support. So for our final slide in the SBIR strategy section, I just wanted to address the importance of letters of support for your proposal package. These demonstrate to reviewers the support of important stakeholders, such as leaders in your field, research partners, or potential customers. Going back to the importance of your team, this is another place to make the case that you're working with the best. And the letters provide evidence of those people's willingness to contribute to your success. So at this point, we can go to the next slide. And does anyone have any questions about SBIR strategy before we talk a little bit about the budget?
Yes, question.
Go ahead.
Letters of support. Could you tell me what that would look like? I thought that having the partners, you were saying that a partner is an institution when it comes to an S, when it comes to the TTR.
Mhm.
Right, right. Okay. And then, but it doesn't, it's sub awardees for SBIR.
Mhm.
So it's a two-part question. What's the difference between a sub awardee being for SBR versus the institution for the TTR? And then that number two question, why would we still need letters of support? Can it come from their institutions?
So the difference between the STTR and the SBIR is a matter of proportion. So with the SBIR, your sub awardee can only receive about a third, like up to a third
Okay,
of your grant's funding.
okay,
Whereas that proportion is different it's larger for an STTR
got it.
because it's more of a partnership versus a sub award.
Okay,
So if you say you're applying for an SBIR and you have a sub award to a university, I believe that university will be required to give you a letter of support. But it's important to think about the other stakeholders, like I mentioned. So, maybe your company has an advisor, say, who's a leader in whatever field you're in, and they can give you a letter of support, talking about how great your technology is and it's the great new thing and so forth. And they're actually going to, they don't just think it's great, they're actually going to provide you with some resource, maybe their time, whatever it is, their expertise, to help you complete your project. Or maybe you're to the point where you've started talking to potential customers and you have talked to somebody who is interested in, or maybe buying, maybe even just testing, in some way working with you to further your objectives. So it's important and sometimes required to have a letter of support from your your partners who are written into the grant, who are in the budget. But in terms of your argument, like I said, the argument about your team, your expertise, your team's expertise, and the market potential of your product, it's important to think about who else around you, whether they have a relationship with the company or maybe they will in the future, who else supports you, in any number of ways. Like I said, time, expertise, partnership, resources, sales, whatever applies to you. It's just important. It's important to make the case to your reviewers. It's not just you. It's not just your direct partners or subawardees that care about this. There are other people out there who care and who are willing to support you in material ways.
thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. This is Lydia. And I'm sorry I came late. I had the opportunity a while ago to be part of the review of some grants writing and things. And my point here is something that really makes me concerned. When we create the plan, when we are specifics, we put them there, we talk about our investigation and team and what is relevant to us and what is really the contribution we will provide with this project. It shows like we are repeating ourselves one and after time. How can we present it in such a way that really, do we have to keep it like that, or because it was said at the beginning, or we really need to point it at each time?
I don't think I can quite understand your question. Could you rephrase it for me?
Yes, when we create a plan and we write the specifics, and we also explain the contributions that we may get or give through this project, and all the relevant things that we will do with the money, with this grant. It really shows, and when we are reading the papers, when they are reading the papers, we are repeating ourselves almost on in every step, because the specifics has to be there, as you said, how long it will take, who will do it, what the support we have, and what we wants to do, our table time and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we do it in such a way that they don't get bored on reading the same over and over?
That's a good question. Do you mean within one grant or across a selection of grants?
No, a selection of grants, and really you say, But I think because every point you have to put the same thing, but it comes to a moment that you need to be a little bit more creative.
Right. That's a really good question. I mean, I agree. I think to a large, like I just said, earlier, you have to follow their directions. But I guess I would say, to try and set yourself apart, I would figure out how to marry those details that we keep talking about, like the objectives and the specific aims with your vision, because I feel like your the proposal is a kind of story, right? It's an argument about why you should be funded, and I feel like what you're selling is your vision. It's in some way it's a vision of a better world, right? Or a better technology. But there are very specific steps that you have to take to achieve that vision. And a phase one proposal is like maybe not step one, but it's pretty early. It's, you haven't gotten very far yet. I think you're right. I think that is a challenge, but I would say think about, don't just sort of fill in the blanks. You're not filling in a form. Think about what excites you about your work, and then try to convey that to your reviewers. And I don't know, I think that again, that comes back to the story you're telling and the vision that you want to show them. There's some reason that you're doing this. I think it relates a lot to your why and the significance question, the who cares question. There's an argument to be made using research about, like I said, why is this a big problem? How much is this problem worth? There's a lot of research and numbers you can bring to answering that. But I think there's always going to be a really personal answer to that too. And, maybe you can't get into that whole story in your proposal, but I think to the extent that you can convey some of that excitement, I don't know, I think that's one way to try and differentiate yourself. But you bring up a good point. It's hard to do that when you have, these boundaries that you have to stay within.
And I appreciate it helps, because in keeping up showing the excitement and why I am inspired, and why the team is working on this, it helps so we don't sound repetitive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, let's keep going, and we should have some more time for questions at the end. But for now, let's go to the next slide and start talking about the budget. So go ahead, next slide. So budget overview. just like with the SBIR strategy, I'm really only going to be able to give a brief overview of the budget, which is also going to differ from agency to agency. Basically, though, your budget is going to have 3 categories. First, unallowable expenses. Second, allowable expenses. And third, the profit, which is usually called the fee. So first, unallowable expenses. These include anything that you cannot use grant funding to pay for, such as patenting or marketing. Second, allowable expenses include 2 components. First, direct expenses, which for a phase 1 SBIR mostly covers research and development in the form of labor. And second, indirect expenses, or like G&A, general and administrative, some people say, which are some of the expenses of running a business, like your rent, for example. In your budget, these indirect expenses are often represented by an accepted rate. And then third, we have the fee or the profit, which is usually 7% of the grant total and is yours to spend as you see fit. So this means that you can spend the fee on unallowable expenses, like applying for a patent. Don't ever leave the fee out of your grant application, even if you don't know what you're going to spend it on. Unforeseen expenses will pop up, and you want to have that resource available to you. Note also that SBIR proposals are not competitive on price. You're competing based on your innovation and the other factors that we've discussed. So take advantage of the budget ceiling available to you for the completion of your objectives. Next slide, please. Components. Here's another way of looking at what I just said. For an SBIR, you have a funding ceiling within which you need to complete your objectives or specific aims, and which differs by agency. This total amount includes the fee or profit of usually around 7% that you should request and will receive in addition to your total for R&D. The total also includes your indirect and direct costs. So the diagram on the right shows another way to think about it. The funding ceiling minus the fee minus the indirect costs equals the direct costs, which is what you have for your R&D. And then a final note, some agencies offer what's called Technical and Business Assistance, or TABA funding. This is an amount in addition to the funding ceiling that can be spent on otherwise unallowable expenses like market research or IP protection. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes everything we've just talked about in the SBIR strategy section that should be addressed by your proposal from both a technical and commercial perspective. You're writing a proposal because you've identified a problem that needs to be addressed. Your innovation is a technical solution with significant commercial potential. Your team, approach, and environment make up the resources that will help you implement your solution, which starts with this proposal. Next slide, please. I think let's keep going, and we're almost done, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I just wanted to touch on the time commitment and emphasize the importance of being prepared. I've heard estimates for writing your SBIR range from 120 to 150 or more hours, which is, of course, a significant amount of work, but it's absolutely something you can do with the right plan. Next slide, please. Remember the best practices, which I've adapted slightly here for the SBIR proposal writing process. First, give yourself plenty of time to plan and execute. Second, read the solicitation thoroughly to understand exactly what your funder wants. Third, follow the directions so you don't get disqualified for administrative errors. Fourth, remember to both teach and sell your vision, which we were just talking about. Make every single element of your proposal count. Don't waste a single word, and don't let anything, whether it's grammatical errors or gaps in logic, take your reader out of your argument. And fifth, finally, use your resources, including the people and the organizations that are set up to help you succeed. Next slide, please. again, first steps. If you're feeling overwhelmed, here are 3 things you can start with. Register your company with sam.gov and sba.gov. Number 2, research your funding opportunities on grants.gov and sbir.gov. And third, start thinking about your timeline and making a plan to execute. Next, please. Here are a few resources, many of which we've already mentioned. Under registration, I just talked about those, plus the Apex Accelerator, which we talked about earlier. To research funding opportunities, sbir.gov/awards. To find actual funding opportunities, grants.gov and sbir.gov/topics. And then finally, kind of like the Apex Accelerator, every state has a FAST program, FAST, FAST. And that's another resource that you can use to help with your research and identifying agencies, opportunities. They teach webinars, they do all kinds of things to help people apply for these grants. And they do some reviewing and evaluation of proposals. So again, every state has one, and you can look